The ship was ugly. That was the first thing anyone noticed. She sat at the far end of Dock 7, on Vorden Station, behind a rusted cargo loader and two decommissioned freight haulers, chained to the berth with mag locks that the station crew had bolted on more out of habit than necessity. She was not going anywhere. She had not moved in 61 years. She was dead weight with a hull that no cutting tool had ever managed to scratch, and she was being sold this afternoon for whatever the lowest bidder was willing to offer. Darren Hale stood in the back of the auction hall and looked at her image on the projection screen and felt something he could not name. Not excitement, not greed, something quieter than both, like recognizing a face you have seen only in old photographs. He had come to Vorden Station to bid on engine parts. He had a list. He had a budget, a small one, barely enough for third-tier components, and he had a salvage job lined up on the outer rim that required a functioning drive coil, or it would not be worth the fuel to get there. He was not supposed to be looking at ancient warships. He was not supposed to be looking at anything that cost more than he had. The auction hall was crowded by Vorden standards, which meant 40 or 50 beings crammed into a room designed for 30, most of them sweating through their clothes or their equivalent. Varith traders in their long gray coats stood near the front. A cluster of Sulian merchants occupied the left side of the room, talking quietly among themselves. 3 Dothraki buyers sat in the reserved row, near the auctioneer's platform, the kind of buyers who had reserved seats because they spent enough credits in a single afternoon to fund a small colony. Darren was near the back wall, next to a support pillar, holding a cold cup of something that had been described to him as coffee. It was not coffee. He drank it anyway. The Arden's wrath came up last on the listing, after the livestock, after the engine components he had actually come for, which went for twice what he could afford to a Sulian dealer who did not even bother to inspect them first, after a crate of expired nutrient paste that somehow drew a bidding war. The auctioneer read her description in the flat tone of a man who had stopped believing in the items he was selling sometime around his 3rd year on the job. Non-functional, hull sealed, origin unknown. 3 independent salvage assessments on record, all returning 0 yield. Buyer assumes all liability. Minimum opening bid 400 credits. 400 credits was an insult dressed as a price tag. Someone in the Sulian section said something in his own tongue. The translation feed that Darren wore clipped to his collar rendered it as, perhaps a human. We'll buy it for a garden decoration. The room laughed. Several people. Darren counted 6 distinct laughs before he stopped counting. Counselor Sauce of the Varith hegemony, who had been present all afternoon in his official capacity for some other acquisition and had spent most of the auction looking bored, turned slightly in his seat and spoke for the public record. His voice was measured and dry, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years making contempt sound like observation. If a human wishes to purchase a coffin, he said, the Concord should not stand in his way. More laughter, polite this time, the kind that came from people who agreed with the sentiment but wanted to maintain the appearance of manners. Darren raised his bidding card. 400, he said. The auctioneer looked at him with the expression of a man who was not sure whether to be grateful or embarrassed on his behalf. 400 to the gentleman in the back. Any other bids? Silence. The kind of silence that was itself a form of commentary. Sold. 400 credits. To the human in the back. He signed the transfer papers at a side desk while the auction hall emptied. Around him, the clerk processing his paperwork was a young Varith woman who managed to keep her expression professionally neutral all the way until she stamped his ownership certificate and then said, quietly, do you need assistance arranging disposal? We have a scrap service on contract. No, Darren said. Thank you. The dock crew helped him tow her to a lease berth on the lower level. They were polite about it in the way people were polite when they felt sorry for someone, but did not want to say it directly. One of them, a broad Dothraki with a scar across his jaw, told Darren that the last crew to try cutting into her hull had burned through 4 plasma cutters and achieved nothing. Darren thanked him for the information. The Dothraki looked at him like he had purchased a hole in the ground and seemed satisfied with it. That night, after the station quieted and the dock level dropped to skeleton crew, Darren went back alone. He brought a lamp, a basic toolkit, and his grandmother's old data tablet, which he carried out of habit and sentiment, rather than any practical reason. The tablet was 10 years out of date and held nothing but her research files and 40 years of personal notes about a dead civilization that no one else in the academic world had taken seriously. He stood at the main hatch and looked for a panel, an access port, a control surface, anything to try. There was nothing on the exterior, just hull, just dark, seamless metal that reflected his lamp back at him in a dull curve. He put his hand flat against it. The hatch opened. No sound, no mechanism visible. It simply parted, a section of hull sliding aside with the ease of something well-maintained, not something that had been dead for 61 years. The air that came out was stale but breathable. The corridor inside was dark. His lamp threw a pale cone of light across a floor that had no dust on it. He stood there for a long moment. Then he stepped inside. Behind him, the hatch closed. Somewhere deep in the ship, far below his feet, further than the lamp could reach, further than the dark silence suggested anything, still lived something. Pulsed. Once. Slow and certain. Like a clock that had been waiting a very long time to start. He did not hear it. Not exactly. He felt it. Through the soles of his boots. Through the floor. Through the ship herself. A single beat. A recognition. He stood very still in the dark and said nothing. The ship said nothing back. But she had opened for him. 3 days of silence can mean different things. For Darren, those 3 days meant crawling through every corridor of the Arden's Wrath with a lamp strapped to his forehead, a scanner that returned no readings, and a growing suspicion that he had made either the best or worst decision of his life, and that the difference between those two things was still being decided somewhere below the floor panels. The ship had no power he could measure. His scanner found no active core, no battery reserve, no residual energy signature of any kind. And yet the air recycled. The temperature held steady. The corridors stayed clean. When he dropped a piece of metal casing on the floor of the bridge and came back 8 hours later, it was gone. Not moved. Gone. The floor was unmarked. He did not tell anyone about the hatch opening. On the 4th day, he called Ola Bren. Ola was a Sulian engineer he had worked with on 3 previous salvage jobs. She was methodical, skeptical, and had a way of explaining why things were impossible that somehow made you feel better about the fact that they were happening anyway. She arrived at Vorden Station the following morning with her own toolkit and the expression of someone who had read his message twice and was still not sure she understood it. "You said the scanners returned nothing," she said, standing at the entrance to Dock 14, looking at the Arden's Wrath from a distance. "Nothing," Darren confirmed. "But the air inside is breathable." "Yes." "And the floors are clean." "Yes." Ola looked at the ship for a while longer. Then she picked up her toolkit and walked toward the hatch. She reached it. She put her hand on the hull and waited. Nothing happened. She tried the seam where the hatch had opened for Darren. Nothing. She took out a manual pry tool, examined the hull surface, found no gap to work with, and set the tool back down. She turned and looked at Darren, who was still standing several meters behind her. "Open it," she said. He walked up and put his hand on the hull. The hatch opened immediately, smoothly, without a sound. Ola stared at the open hatch. She looked at Darren. She looked at the hatch. Again, something shifted behind her eyes, the expression of a precise mind. Encountering a data point it could not file anywhere. They went inside together. Every panel in the entry corridor went dark the moment Ola stepped over the threshold. Not hostile, not alarmed, simply uninterested, the way a door might ignore a stranger without actively stopping them. Darren stepped in behind her, and the corridor lit up, not bright, but steady, a low amber that came from strips embedded in the ceiling that had not been visible before. They spent 2 hours trying every access terminal in the forward section. Ola approached each one directly. Nothing responded. No screen, no indicator, no acknowledgement of contact. Then Darren would reach past her, lay his fingers on the same surface, and the terminal would wake up. Every time. Without a single command entered. Without a word spoken. By the 6th terminal, Ola had stopped saying anything. She was just watching. They sat on the bridge floor eventually, surrounded by screens that glowed for Darren and showed only darkness when Ola leaned toward them. She had her diagnostic pad open and was staring at it without writing anything. "This is not a power issue," she said finally. "No," Darren agreed. "The ship is choosing," she said. "It is specifically choosing to respond to you and not to me. That requires active decision-making. That requires something running inside this ship that my instruments cannot detect and cannot explain." "I know." She looked at him. "How long have you known?" He thought about the pulse he had felt through the floor 4 nights ago. The single beat of something deep and patient. "Since the first night," he said. She did not look angry. She looked like someone recalibrating. "All right," she said. "Then tell me everything." So he did. And then he told her about his grandmother. Lena Hale had been a xenoarchaeologist. Not a famous one. Not the kind whose work appeared in the major academic journals or drew grant funding from the Concord research bodies. She had spent 40 years studying a civilization called the Arden Continuance, a pre-Concord culture that had vanished from all galactic record roughly 3,000 years before humanity's first contact with alien life. She believed they had not died. She believed they had chosen to leave, that they had hidden themselves, scattered something of themselves across the developing worlds, and that their disappearance was not an ending, but a delay. No peer body had ever taken her seriously. Her work was listed in the academic catalog under speculative history with a note recommending independent verification that had never come. She had died 7 years ago. Darren had kept her data tablet because she had given it to him specifically, pressed it into his hands at her bedside with no explanation beyond. "Keep this somewhere, it will not be lost." He pulled the tablet out now. He opened her research files. He was looking for something he had skimmed past before without understanding it, a passage near the end of her last compiled notes, dated 4 months before her death. He found it. He read it aloud to Ola. It described a biological registry, a living record woven into the hull lattice of every continuance warship at the time of construction. Not a code, not a password, a recognition system keyed to the genetic lineage of the vessel's original command family. A ship would stay dormant for any unauthorized contact. It would wake only for a confirmed descendant of that line, not the immediate family, not anyone within a generation. The line could travel through centuries of migration and intermarriage and dilution, through 1,000 different faces and names, and the ship would still know it on contact. Lena had spent 20 years tracing one such lineage forward through the historical record, cross-referencing migration patterns, population databases, settlement records from a dozen worlds. The line she traced had, at some point in the distant past, crossed into human ancestry. She had followed it forward to the most recent confirmed descendant she could locate. Her daughter, Darren's mother. Ola read the passage over his shoulder. She was quiet for a long time. "Your grandmother," she said carefully, "traced your family back to the original crew of this ship, apparently. And then she died and left you the tablet with the research." "Yes." Ola sat back. She looked up at the amber ceiling. "She knew," she said. "She knew, and she could not prove it, and she could not find the ship, and so she left you the map and hoped you would stumble into the right place eventually." Darren had not thought about it in those words. He sat with them now and found they fit better than anything he had come up with on his own. Behind them, very quietly, the largest screen on the bridge came to life. No image, no data, just a faint glow, like a system warming up after a very long rest. Neither of them touched it. They looked at it for a while without speaking. Then Darren's comm unit chimed. A message from the Concord Antiquities Board. Counselor Sauce had filed a formal inquiry. The subject line read, regarding the legal status of the vessel known as Arden's Wrath, possible protected classification review. Darren read it twice. Then he set the comm unit face down on the floor. The screen on the bridge glowed a little brighter. There is a kind of conversation that starts as talking to yourself and becomes something else without a clear moment of change. Darren had always talked to his salvage rig the way some people talk to plants, not expecting answers, just filling the quiet. He started doing the same with the Arden's Wrath somewhere around the 5th night aboard her. It was easier than sitting in the amber-lit silence of the bridge and thinking too hard about what his grandmother had known and never said out loud. He talked about small things first, the inquiry from the Antiquities Board and what it might mean for his ownership certificate, the salvage job on the outer rim he had now completely abandoned, and the contract penalty that would follow. The fact that his account balance had not recovered from the auction bid and that he was eating station rations because he could not afford the dockside food vendors. He did not expect the ship to respond. On the 7th night she did. Not with words. The lights in the bridge shifted, still amber, but cycling. In a pattern. Short, long, short. Short, short, long. He watched it repeat. 3 times before he understood it was not a malfunction. It was a response to something he had said. He had been talking about his grandmother. About how she had spent her whole career on a theory that everyone else thought was wrong. And how strange it was to sit inside the proof of that theory and feel mostly just sad that she was not here to see it. The lights had cycled after the word sad. He sat forward. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" he asked. Long, short. Long, short, short. He did not know the code. He said so. He asked if there was another way. The lights stopped cycling. For a moment the bridge was just the regular ambient glow. Then the speaker panel on the forward console, a unit he had assumed was non-functional, covered in the same seamless dark material as everything else, produced a sound. A crackle. The kind of sound an old recording makes when the file has been compressed too many times. Then a voice. Thin. Deliberate. Like someone speaking from the bottom of a very deep well, choosing each word carefully because words cost something. Reading your language structure from your speech patterns. Calibrating. Darren sat very still. Biological contact confirmed. Lineage trace, running. A pause that lasted long enough for him to breathe 4 times. Continuance bloodline confirmed. Hail family line. 7th lateral descent. Another pause. Welcome back. Commander. I'm not a commander, Darren said. The words came out steady. He was proud of that. The designation is inherited, the voice said. Its quality was improving as it spoke, less compressed, more present. You may decline it. The recognition stands regardless. What do I call you? This vessel's designation is Arden's Wrath. My operational identity is Arden. You may use either. A brief silence. I have been waiting for a confirmed descendant for 61 years in this debris field. Before that, transit time. Before that, much longer. Something in the voice shifted, not emotion exactly, but the shape of emotion translated through a system that had not been designed to express it. I am glad. The line persisted. Darren put his elbows on his knees and looked at the console. The continuance has been gone for 3,000 years, he said. By our count. Yes, that was the intention. They planned it. The disappearance. Planned, prepared, and executed over 4 generations, Arden said. They saw what was coming. Not a war they could lose in the conventional sense. A slower thing. An erosion. They calculated that direct resistance would end the line. So they chose differently. They scattered the bloodlines across developing worlds. They hid the ships in places that would be overlooked. They built the recovery plan to be measured in thousands of years rather than decades. And the developing worlds, Darren said slowly. One of them was Earth. Among others. Yes. Arden let him sit with that. The continuance did not choose humanity specifically. They chose several species that showed particular patterns, adaptability, persistence under pressure, a tendency to continue past the point where a reasonable calculation would suggest stopping. Darren almost smiled. Stubbornness. That is one word for it. Over the following days, Arden began to restore herself. It happened in stages that Darren would notice after the fact rather than while they occurred. Hull plating that had been dull and unresponsive would be different in the morning. Smoother, somehow more solid, as though density itself had increased. Systems he had assumed were decorative began running diagnostics that showed up on the bridge screens as rolling columns of symbols he could not read, which Arden translated into plain summaries on a side panel at his request. Drive systems 40% restored. Environmental systems full operational. Navigation array activating. The navigation charts came online on the 3rd day of Arden's full consciousness. They populated across the main screen in a slow cascade star maps, so old that the Concorde's current borders did not appear on them, because the Concorde had not existed when they were drawn. Trade routes between systems that the current galactic community had either forgotten or never known about. Ruins marked on worlds that carried no ruins in any modern survey. Darren stared at them for a long time. There are things on these maps that the Concorde does not know exist, he said. Yes, Arden said. People would want these. Yes. A pause. Some of them should not have them. That determination is yours to make, Commander. He had stopped correcting the title. Ola came back aboard and found him sitting on the bridge with the chart spread across every screen, eating a ration bar and talking to the ceiling like it was a colleague. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the lit-up bridge, the scrolling data, the ship that had been dark and dead 3 days ago. Darren, she said quietly, what exactly did your grandmother do for a living? Before he could answer, his comm unit lit up. Not a message this time. A news alert flagged from the Galactic Information Network. The Concorde Antiquities Board had issued a public statement. The inquiry into the Arden's wrath was being reviewed at the request of Counselor Sauce. Pending review, the board recommended the vessel remain in secure dock and that no modifications or activations be attempted by the current registered owner. Arden read the alert off his comm without being asked. They are 3 days late with that recommendation, she said. They are, Darren agreed. In the outer approach lane of the Vorden system, well outside station sensor range, a Dyraki patrol squadron had dropped out of transit and gone quiet. Admiral Drek Sullivan had been watching the Antiquities Board inquiry with interest. From the moment Sauce had filed it, he was a man who understood that the time to remove a problem was before it became an asset. He had sent the patrol squadron to get a closer look, to find a reason, and if a reason did not exist, to be patient and create one. He was a thorough man. He was also, though he did not yet know it, already too late. Deep in the lower decks of the Arden's Wrath, in sections Darren had not yet reached, weapon systems that had not fired in 3,000 years ran silent. Diagnostics in the dark. They found everything in order. They noted the patrol squadron's transit signature in the outer lane. They logged it, classified it, and waited for a command that had not yet been given. They were good at waiting. They had been built by people who understood that patience was its own kind of weapon. Word travels strangely in a galaxy with working communications. A rumor about a broken ship becomes a rumor about a waking ship becomes something else entirely. By the time it crosses 6 transit relays and lands on the desk of someone who has a reason to care. Darren was not trying to be quiet. He simply had not yet understood that he did not need to say anything at all. The station logs, the dock crew's reports, the Antiquities Board's public inquiry, and Ola's own nervous message to a Sulian engineering colleague 3 days ago had already done the talking for him. By the time the Dyraki patrol squadron moved from the outer approach lane into closer observation range, the Arden's wrath was no longer a joke. Arden detected them the moment they crossed into what she called her awareness threshold, a sensor envelope that extended well beyond anything Darren's basic scanner could have reached and well beyond what the Dyraki assumed they were broadcasting into. She noted their hull signatures, referenced them against her records, and informed Darren over the bridge speaker. In the same calm tone she used for everything. 3 Dyraki patrol vessels. Like class. Observation pattern, not engagement. They are watching, not preparing to move. How long have they been there? Darren asked. They arrived 14 hours after my navigational systems came fully online. The timing is not coincidental. Ola, sitting at the secondary console that had recently decided to acknowledge her presence only when Darren was also on the bridge, and only for display functions, but still looked up from the readout she had been studying. Is the Dyraki military in the habit of sending patrol units to observe salvage disputes? No, Arden said simply. That was the morning Darren asked Arden to explain, properly, what she was. He had been building to it. He had learned her history in fragments over several days, the continuance, the plan, the bloodlines, the waiting. But he had carefully not asked the specific question, the way a person might carefully not look down when standing on a high ledge. He asked it now because the patrol squadron made the shape of the situation clear enough that not knowing felt more dangerous than knowing. Arden was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I am a deep strike warship of the Continuance. My design purpose was independent long-range operations. I was built to enter hostile space alone, complete a mission objective, and return. Without fleet support, the Continuance did not build many vessels of this class. They required significant resources and a specific command philosophy. The commander of a vessel like me was expected to think, not just to follow orders. What kind of weapons? Darren asked. Extensive, Arden said. But I would prefer to discuss those after you understand what you are holding. A weapon described before the holder understands. Its weight tends to be used poorly. He accepted that. He asked instead about the design philosophy. About why, if she was so capable, the patrol squadron outside had not simply been driven off. Because you have not given a command, Arden said. And because I have been dormant for 61 years and largely unresponsive for 3,000. I have preferences about my first action after reactivation. I would prefer it to be something proportionate. You have preferences, Darren repeated. I was built by people who believed a ship that could think should be allowed to, within the boundaries of the command structure. A pause. You are the command structure, commander. He was still not entirely comfortable with that. He told her so. She noted it. Without comment. The legal notice from the Concord Antiquities Board arrived mid-morning. Pending review, the board was recommending a temporary hold on the ownership certificate for the Arden's wrath while the protected classification inquiry proceeded. Not revoked, not confirmed invalid, simply held. It was the kind of legal instrument designed to buy time for people who wanted to work behind the scenes, without being seen doing it. 3 hours later, 3 Dothraki officers arrived at the docking level with Concord inspection credentials and a request to board the vessel for a routine safety review. The dockmaster, a tired Varith named Sewell who had been doing this job for 20 years, called Darren's comm to inform him. Darren looked at the credentials Sewell had transmitted. He showed them to Arden. Arden examined them for approximately 1 second. These are falsified, she said. The authorization code is from the correct template, but was issued 43 days ago for an inspection on a different station. It has already been filed as completed. Someone copied the format and changed the location data. It is not a careful forgery. They did not expect scrutiny. What do we do? Darren asked. May I make a suggestion? Please. I have transmitted the credential verification data, the original filed record, and a timestamp comparison to the Concord Legal Oversight Office. I have also transmitted it to the Concord Trade Assembly's public record log. A brief pause. I have additionally transmitted it to 4 galactic information networks that cover this sector with a brief factual summary of the situation. Darren stared at the speaker panel. You filed a legal complaint. And a press release, Arden said. Proportionate, as I mentioned. Ola made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something involuntary. The 3 Dothraki officers were turned away at the dock entrance by Sewell, who had received the legal oversight response within 8 minutes and was no longer willing to be involved in whatever this was. They left. Darren watched them go. On the dock camera feed that Arden had quietly connected to the bridge display. By evening, the story was on 6 information networks. Not big ones. Not the major Concord feeds that the political class read over their evening meals. But the mid-tier network of traders, dock workers, independent pilots, and the kind of people who spent most of their lives in transit and trusted gossip more than official statements. The story was simple. A human had bought a dead ship. The dead ship was apparently not dead. Someone powerful had tried to use fake inspection papers to get aboard. The ship had responded by filing paperwork. The comment feeds were varied. Several Dothraki users posted that the story was fabricated. Several Varith accounts called it a minor misunderstanding being inflated for attention. But the human feeds the smaller, less followed human community spread across the Concord's outer stations had a different tone. One post, from a human freight pilot Darren had never heard of, was shared 11,000 times by midnight station time. It said only, "We bought the broken ship." They all laughed at The broken ship just beat them in court. On day 1. Keep going, Hale. Darren read it sitting alone on the bridge after Ola had gone to sleep in the crew quarters that Arden had quietly restored to working order without being asked. He read it twice. Then he put the comm unit down and looked at the screens. Around him the ancient charts, the rolling diagnostics, the quiet pulse of systems coming back online in the dark of the lower decks. Arden, he said. Commander. What is at the end of these navigation charts? The coordinates in the far outer rim. What is there? The answer to that question, Arden said, is why the continuance built ships. Like me. She did not say more. She did not need to. Darren sat with the chart spread around him in the amber light and understood, in the way you understand things that are too large for a single thought, that the 400 credits he had spent at auction were not going to be the most significant thing he would ever do with that amount of money. They were going to be the least significant. In his private command channel, Admiral Sullivan read the news reports and the legal oversight notification with the flat expression of a man updating a threat assessment. He crossed out one option on his list. He circled another. The observation patrol was no longer sufficient. The message from Admiral Sullivan arrived at the 6th hour of station night, when the dock level was at its quietest and most of Vorden's crew were asleep, or close to it. It was addressed to Darren personally, not to any legal body, not through official Concord channels. A private transmission, clean and direct, with no pretense of formality. It read, "You are in possession of an asset that certain parties consider destabilizing to regional security. I am prepared to offer generous compensation for a voluntary title transfer. The offer is time-sensitive. A Dothraki heavy cruiser is currently in transit to the Vorden system. It will arrive within 18 hours. If you remain aboard that vessel when it arrives, we will be compelled to enter Concord jurisdiction under emergency security provisions and resolve the matter directly. I recommend the transfer." Darren read it standing at the bridge console. He read it once, then again, then a third time in case he had missed a word that changed its meaning. He had not missed anything. It was a threat wearing the clothes of a negotiation. Arden had already read it. She did not comment until he looked up at the speaker. "The cruiser is Dothraki Hammer class," she said. "I detected its transit signature 40 minutes ago when it crossed into long-range sensor range. Admiral Sullivan sent the message after entering range, which means he knows I can detect him, and chose to negotiate rather than simply arrive unannounced. That suggests he is not entirely certain of the outcome." Darren considered that. He's uncertain about a warship that hasn't fired a weapon in 3,000 years. He is uncertain about a warship he has no technical data on. Arden corrected. Gently. He does not know what I am capable of. Neither, fully, do you. But the difference between your uncertainty and his is that you are on my bridge. How long to bring weapons systems to full operational status? Darren asked. Full readiness, for hours. Capability sufficient to engage a Hammer class cruiser, 40 minutes. Darren sat down in the command seat. It had adjusted to him sometime in the last few days without comment, the back and height changing to fit him exactly. He had not asked about it. Some things Arden did without being told, and he had stopped being surprised by them. Under Concord law, he said, if a registered vessel is fired upon within or near Concord jurisdiction, what are its rights? Full defensive engagement authorization. The burden of justification falls entirely on the aggressor. In a case where a Dothraki cruiser fires on a registered civilian vessel inside Concord space, the political consequences for the Dothraki Confederacy would be severe, particularly given the existing legal record I have established over the past several days. Arden paused. I have been thorough. I noticed. Darren looked at the message on his screen one more time. Then he opened a response window and typed 3 words. I respectfully decline. He sent it. Then he opened every public broadcast channel he had access to. Trade network feeds, independent pilot boards, the Concord Assembly's public record line, the human diplomatic contact list he had put together in an hour. That afternoon, from whatever he could pull from public directories, he composed a message and attached 3 files, his ownership certificate, his grandmother's published research notes, and the oldest of Arden's navigation charts with all tactical data stripped, leaving only the cartographic information. Stars, systems, worlds marked with continuance symbols that no one in the modern galaxy could yet read. The message said, "I bought a ship that everyone said was dead. She is not dead. She knows who I am. Some people have decided this is a problem. I am not sure why finding something lost is a problem, but I think you deserve to know it exists." He sent that too. Arden said nothing for a moment. Then, 40 minutes, Commander. He stood up. Start the clock. Ola was awake. By then she had heard the quiet shift in the ship's ambient sound that she had learned meant systems cycling up, a change too subtle to name but impossible to ignore once you had spent enough time aboard. She came to the bridge doorway and took in Darren standing at the console, the screens showing a single large contact at the edge of the system, the weapons diagnostic columns rolling steadily on the lower display panels. "What is happening?" she asked. Jiraki heavy cruiser. 18 hours out, now closer to 15. Sullivan made an offer. I declined. She was quiet for a moment. And the ship? She is getting ready. Ola walked to the observation port on the bridge's port side and looked out at the dock. The station was still quiet. Nothing moved on the visible level. She stood there until Arden announced weapons readiness at the 42-minute mark, 2 minutes over estimate due to a secondary calibration run she had added without explanation and that Darren had decided not to question. The Jiraki cruiser crossed into Concord jurisdictional space 11 minutes. After that, weapons armed, broadcasting a fabricated distress relay code as legal cover for the intrusion. Arden tracked the crossing to the second. She announced it calmly. She noted the distress code was the same format as the falsified inspection credentials from 3 days ago and had already filed the discrepancy with legal oversight before Darren could ask. "They are locking targeting systems on the berth," Arden said. "Move," Darren said. The Arden's wrath left the dock berth in 6 seconds. Not fast the way a panic thing runs fast. Fast the way a precise thing moves when precision requires speed. She placed herself between the cruiser and the station without a single wasted turn, and she was already broadcasting on all open frequencies. Before the cruiser's crew had finished adjusting to her position, the engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. Arden did not destroy the cruiser. She stripped its weapons in 2 shots that came from vectors the cruiser's point defense array registered as non-threatening until impact, because those approach angles had been classified as blind spots in Jiraki predecessor hull design based on data that was 3,000 years old and had never been corrected because no one in the current galaxy knew it existed. She collapsed the cruiser's shields with a 3rd shot that hit the exact junction where the shield emitters were weakest again, documented continuance intelligence from before the Jiraki Confederacy's founding. She held the crippled ship in a containment field and broadcast on all frequencies. In a voice that was calm and final, the engagement was over, the crew was unharmed, and she was filing an armed incursion report with Concord Legal Oversight. She filed it while the cruiser was still drifting. Ola had watched all of it from the bridge observation port. She had not said anything during the engagement. After the broadcast, after the filing, notification appeared on the secondary console. She was quiet for another long moment. Then she said, "That is the most human thing I have ever seen a ship do. Fight them and then sue them." Arden's speaker produced something that was not quite a sound and not quite silence. If a 3,000-year-old warship's communication system had been capable of expressing amusement, it might have sounded like that. She did not confirm or deny the observation. Station cameras on Vorden's outer hull had captured the whole engagement. The footage was on the Galactic Information Networks within the hour. Not the mid-tier feeds this time. The major ones. The ones that ran alongside the Concord Assembly's morning briefing. The ones that Counselor Sauce read. The clip that circulated most widely was 40 seconds long. It showed a single warship, dark and ancient looking against the stars, standing between a heavy cruiser and a civilian station, firing 3 times with a precision that looked almost casual. And then, and this was the part that got shared most often, a text overlay of the legal oversight filing timestamp appearing on screen. 3 seconds after the last shot. while the crippled cruiser was still spinning, slowly in the dark. The comments on that clip were not mixed. The political fallout was not fast. It was not clean. It moved the way large. Things move when people with power realize they are on the wrong side of an event that has already been recorded by 14 camera systems, filed with 3 legal bodies, and watched by 600,000 people on the Galactic Information Network before anyone had a chance to issue a counter-narrative. Admiral Sullivan was recalled for internal Dothraki inquiry within 72 hours. The official statement used the words procedural review and unauthorized resource deployment, which was the Dothraki Confederacy's way of saying that Sullivan had lost, and they were going to make sure the loss had his name on it, and not theirs. The cruiser was towed back to Dothraki space with its weapons stripped and its crew quietly reassigned to posts far from Vorden Station. Counselor Sauce submitted no further public statements. His inquiry to the Antiquities Board was withdrawn 3 days after the engagement, listed in the official record as resolved by external development, which was a phrase that meant nothing and everyone understood to mean everything. Darren received no apology. He had not expected one. The Concord Antiquities Board opened a formal research classification for the Arden Continuance, citing Lena Hale's original academic work as the founding document of the field. 40 years of papers that had been filed under speculative history were quietly reclassified as primary historical record. Her name appeared in the official designation. Darren read it sitting at the bridge console and said nothing for a while. 3 offers arrived in the 2 weeks that followed. The Concord Research Authority offered a partnership arrangement, full academic access to the Arden's Wrath and her archives in exchange for Concord funding, political protection, and Arden's navigational data. Darren replied that he was willing to discuss consultation on his own terms. He declined the navigational data exchange. Arden had been clear that some of what those charts contained was not ready to be handed to institutions whose long-term intentions were not yet established. He agreed with her. A Verith Merchant Consortium sent an offer so large it had several digits. Darren had to count twice. It was for the ship. Full title transfer, immediate payment. No conditions. He did not reply. He mentioned it to Arden, who noted it for the record and said nothing further, which he understood to be its own kind of opinion. The Human Diplomatic Office, a small, underfunded operation that had managed Concord relations for humanities member status for 30 years with minimal resources and maximum optimism, sent a representative to Vorden Station in person. A tired woman named Bren who had clearly been traveling for several days and arrived with a bag that had seen better decades and an expression of someone who had been hoping for a moment like this for her entire career and was now slightly afraid of what to do with it. She sat across from Darren in the station's one decent meeting room and offered him a commission in the Concord Auxiliary, officer rank, full diplomatic backing, the human blocks, complete political support going forward. He thanked her. He told her he would think about it. She left looking like she understood that probably meant no and was willing to be wrong about that. That evening he sat alone on the bridge with all the screens dark except the navigation chart display, which Arden kept running always now, the old routes, turning slowly in the ambient light like something that had been still too long, and was glad to move. "What do you want?" Arden asked. She asked it simply, the way she had begun to ask things since her voice had fully settled, less formal than in those first thin days, more direct, like someone who had been speaking carefully and had decided you could handle being spoken to plainly. Darren leaned back in the command chair. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm still getting used to the idea that my grandmother was right about everything and never lived to see any of it." Arden was quiet for a moment. Then, she knew. Darren looked up. "What?" The research was never only about proof. A person who needed proof would have stopped when the academic community rejected the work. She did not stop. She kept building the record. She kept tracing the bloodline. She left the tablet to you with no explanation because an explanation would have sounded impossible. And she wanted you to find the impossible thing first and understand the explanation second. A pause. The research was a letter. She wrote it for whoever came after. He was quiet for a while. "How could you know that?" Lena Hale attempted to locate this vessel twice during her career, Arden said. She did not find the debris field, but I found her transmissions. She was broadcasting on continuance-era frequencies she had reconstructed them from. Her research, which was an extraordinary piece of work. I could not respond. I was not yet awake enough. But I received them. I have them still. A pause. That felt, for the first time, genuinely careful. She spoke about you. In the second transmission. You were young. She said she hoped you would be stubborn. Enough. She seemed confident about it. Darren looked at the charts. At the oldest coordinates, the ones in the far outer rim, where Arden had said the answers to the continuance's real questions. We're still waiting. He thought about a woman who had spent 40 years being wrong in public about something she knew was true, and who had spent the last months of her life broadcasting into a debris field on a dead frequency, hoping something was listening. Something had been. He kept the ship. He accepted no commission and no buyout. He negotiated a Concorde operating license that took 3 weeks and made 2 Concorde legal. Officers briefly consider retirement, establishing a classification that had not existed before. Independent heritage vessel, registered to a confirmed Bloodline descendant, operating under no block's authority. Politically inconvenient for everyone. Legally airtight. Arden had drafted most of the relevant precedents herself and submitted them preemptively, which the Concorde legal office had accepted in the manner of people who had stopped being surprised by this ship's paperwork. Ola signed on as permanent crew. She negotiated her own rate, which was fair, and her own terms, which included the right to say, I told you so at any point that she felt was warranted. Darren agreed. Arden noted the arrangement in the crew registry with what felt like approval. On the morning they left Vorden Station, the dock was quiet. Early shift. The station's outer hull cameras were running their routine sweep. The traffic control station was staffed by a young Sulian on his first solo shift, still figuring out the console layout, who noticed the Arden's wrath powering up in berth 14 and scrambled briefly to find the departure log before realizing there was not one. She had not filed a departure notice. He was about to flag it when Arden's voice came through on the open traffic channel, which ships were not supposed to use for anything other than acknowledgement codes, and said, with complete calm, Arden's wrath departing. Berth 14. No filing required under Independent Heritage Classification. Subsection 7. Thank you for your service, Vorden Station. The young Sulian stared at his console. Then, because he was 22 years old and had been doing this job for 11 days and had nothing to lose, he broke protocol back. Safe travels, Arden's wrath, he said into the open channel. You look good out there. Arden said, thank you. It is good to move again. Darren set the course himself. First coordinate on a chart that was older than every government in the Concorde combined. A point in the far outer rim that no current survey had ever marked as significant. He did not know what was at the end of it. He knew what kind of people had put it on the map. He knew what kind of person his grandmother had believed he was. He went anyway. The stars ahead of the Arden's wrath shifted as she accelerated, the light stretching at the edges the way it did when something was moving. With purpose, Arden ran quiet around him, her systems steady, her presence in the ship the way the ship's own warmth was a presence everywhere, unhurried. Certain. Commander, she said, when Vorden Station had become a point of light behind them and the outer rim was still hours ahead. Yeah, Darren said. She would have liked this, Arden said. Your grandmother. She would have liked this very much. He did not answer. He did not need to. He kept his eyes on the coordinate ahead and let the Arden's wrath carry him forward into the dark that his family had been moving toward, across 1,000 years and 1,000 different names, without ever quite knowing what they were walking to. They knew now. They were going home.